All right, everyone. Welcome to the Stoa. It's good to have you all here today. So just some Stoa housekeeping before we begin. This will probably be the last session in a couple of months. We're taking a summer break and we'll return in the fall. And we have a great guest before our pause, Tim Reed. Tim is a psychiatrist, psychotherapist, and author of the book Waking Shadows or Walking Shadows. Could be waking as well. Archetype and Psyche in Crisis and Growth. Um, and this is a great book that examines how intense, numinous states are manifested through archetypal forces. He terms archetypal penetrance. Today's session is going to be on high archetypal penetrance or HAP. And I've been wanting to talk to Tim for a while now. His work was introduced to me by David Fuller of Rebel Wisdom during a time when I was going through a HAP phase, which was essentially the state I was in when the Stoa was started back in 2020. So perhaps we'll unpack some of that. But how today is going to work, I'll interview Tim for the first 10 or 20, 30 minutes. And for the second half, we'll have a Q&A. So if you have questions anytime, pop it in the chat and I'll call on you. You can unmute yourself, ask your question to Tim, and you'll have one follow-up. Um, so that being said, Tim, welcome to the Stoa. Oh, you're on mute.
Yeah, well, thank you, Peter, and good to meet you. And it's always nice to be in a company of like-minded people talking about ideas that interest us all.
Hmm.
And I really enjoyed that music you played, by the way. It was felt very appropriate to the theme of this meeting, something kind of invitational, pointing to a bigger picture, touch of a numinous, maybe a touch of the ominous,
Mm,
archetypal feminine, a bit of mystery, excitement. Yeah.
that's cool. 'Cause I always try to like sense into a vibe of a song that matches the session. That's Brian Jonestown Massacre, and the song's title is called Fingertips. So maybe it has archetypes have their fingertips on us.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
so before we get into the high archetypal penetrance, for people who are not familiar with your work, could you introduce it and perhaps the philosophy that underlies it more generally?
Yeah, so um, I'm interested in ideas like Huxley's ideas of transmissive consciousness, so in addition to, the everyday consciousness that is produced by the brain. There's the possibility that there's another bigger consciousness that maybe our brain receives. Um, in ideas such as the some of the quantum physicists who thought that the universe, rather than a machine, was more like a great thought. The physicist David Bohm, who thought that meaning was maybe the fifth dimension, to be added to space-time, and that, in addition to the space-time universe that we're all familiar with, there's a space-time meaning universe, which he called soma significance, and that meaning is an intrinsic feature of everything, and that we are geared really to manage a fairly limited range of meaning, in the same way that our senses will, will only pick up a limited amount of everything that might be available on the light spectrum, so the hearing spectrum, so the taste or smell spectrum. So maybe it's the same with meaning. But we are geared differently, and there are some people that are lucky enough, or sometimes unlucky enough, to be receptive to a greater range of meaning. There are certain things that we can seek out that will give us more meaningful experiences. Obviously, psychedelics, um, which have become a lot more prominent actually since my book was published in 2015. That was right at the beginning of the psychedelic renaissance. So I think we understand a lot more now about how to use psychedelics in a mindful, helpful way. Um, and then, of course, there's that lovely story of Plato's cave, which I guess everyone, is familiar with, about the people at the back of the cave, shackled, looking at the flickering images that are projected onto the back of the cave, which is two-dimensional reality. And that's the metaphor for our day-to-day reality that we very strongly identify with. But actually, there's a much bigger picture. There's a much more complex, multidimensional, more colorful reality that is available to us in certain circumstances, but it's difficult to get to. And the ways of getting to it and returning back with the gifts from it are quite complicated and sometimes hazardous. So I really love that Plato's Cave story. And my book is kind of woven a bit around Plato's Cave, and references that in relation to psychiatric disorders and abnormal mental states, numinous experiences, ominous experiences, the sort of explorations that so many of us do in our search for healing and enlightenment.
Yeah. And this book is really rich. So I highly recommend checking it out. And for this session, I want to focus on the high archetypal penetrance. And you have like also a normal archetypal penetrance nap, and then the like consensus reality, and then a low archetypal penetrance lap. But before getting into that, perhaps it would be best just to get a sense or understanding of what archetype is. How would you define or understand an archetype?
So I think archetypes are the big currents of meaning, um, but with reference to the ideas promoted by like David Bohm that meaning is a part of the universe, and as we go into meaning, it becomes more and more meaning filled, in a way that with our normal senses we can't really comprehend. But as we move, sometimes in more open states, the volume of meaning can be turned up um, in a way that is sometimes very beautiful and we feel very grateful, and it feels like an initiation. Sometimes it's really difficult, and causes us all sorts of problems. So I call that high archetypal penetrant states, in that the numinosity of deeper meaning becomes more available to us, um, as opposed to low archetypal penetrance states when people are very shut off, live in a very kind of dark, uh, contracted, constricted world where not a lot is happening. I mean, a lot of depression is like that. I think a lot of people live lives a bit like that, where the volume of meaning is turned, is turned right down, maybe in the service of survival. Um,
And why do some people have greater capacity to be a hap?
I think that's a really good question. Um, I think it's multifactorial. I think there's probably a genetic predisposition, at least to some extent. So it may be that there's a high, when I was a young psychiatrist, I did some research into the genetics of schizophrenia and bipolar disorder. And the idea was that, you'd find families within which these conditions were concentrated and maybe do a genetic analysis, in the service of finding treatments. Um, and I saw a lot of families like that around the UK. And I found that in these families, there are also a lot of very creative people. A lot of people have done very unusual things. A lot of people that had led very imaginative lives. Their lives had not been conventional. And so I developed the idea really that rather than the genes causing mental illness per se, they conferred a greater sensitivity to meaning, a higher archetypal penetrance, but really could go either way. But basically, you're more open, maybe you're more in tune with the energies of the universe.
And how do these kind of states, these hap states, show up in individuals? What are like the common features?
Well, I guess we can all look back on times when we have felt a high intensity of meaning, and I guess we can all think about times maybe in nature, maybe with music, maybe festivals, maybe falling in love, maybe making love, maybe under a psychedelic experience. Um, there may also be times when we've had ominous experiences. I sometimes think people go to horror films so they can have a taste of a numinous in an ominous form. It's a way of really kind of turning up the intensity of meaning. Um, Has that answered your, was your question something different?
No, that was it. Sort of like for people who maybe in the are napping right now in like a normal archetypal
Yeah.
penetrance. What's like a high archetypal penetrance experience? How would you describe that to them?
Yeah, so often we have these experiences in nature, high mountains, and we intentionally seek out these places. If we can turn away from the everyday chatter of everyday life, then very often we can become more in tune with the more numinous states. But sometimes they just come across us completely unawares, and I find that very often in psychiatry. And you often hear stories in retreats as well as to how sometimes people become flooded with meaning states in a very unexpected way. Sometimes in an extraordinary way. Sometimes people have extraordinary feelings of cosmic unity. Um, without much of a trigger. It's unusual, but it happens.
And related to that, how are these like app states misinterpreted by conventional psychiatry?
Well, I think conventional psychiatry has misinterpreted a lot. I mean, conventional psychiatry came from the perspective that people with mental health problems, it was a physical illness and it was caused by neurochemical imbalances and structural issues in the brain. And actually, there's no evidence that that is the case. And I think what is a much more likely scenario is that we revisit in certain circumstances some archaic feeling states that maybe we felt when we were very young. Sometimes there's a narrative that goes with that. Sometimes it's something that arises pre-verbally when our psychological defenses are not formed, and we feel things very intensely. I mean, you've only got to look at a little baby, um, who's crying, who wants attention, and the feeling that goes into that. A baby that's hungry, a toddler who's having one of those battles with the cosmos and is really expressing it with every cell in their body. Um, and I think we tend to lock some of these feeling states in our psyche. We cover them with defenses. They're very heavily defended against. A lot of energy goes into maintaining those defenses. Um, and sometimes with a certain trigger, these archaic feeling states become unlocked in a way that overwhelms us with its intensity. I think the other thing about these very early feeling states is that because the ego structures are not very well formed, we can have genuinely transpersonal experiences. It's as though there are kind of chinks in ego structures, and we can have powerful feelings of being part of something that's greater than us. Um, Experiences of being connected with the divine. You see this a lot in people with psychiatric disorders, people with what are called manic illnesses. It's where that ego becomes very inflated with energies that maybe become from another place. So that's another form of a high archetypal penetrant state that can be very difficult to be with.
Hmm. And so kind of that brings up this like fine line between the madman and the mystic, that how they say it.
Yeah.
And I'll read the people the passage from your book. Some people may have such genetic load that they are at very high risk of developing serious psychiatric disorder. For others, their tendency to high archetypal penetrance could have an altogether different outcome. And then you give examples of holy men, women, shamans, priests, visionary artists. Um, and this is just this meme. I have to show this that I really like. The mystic swims in the waters that the psychotic drowns. Um,
Yeah.
and yeah, so the question there is like what are the differentiating features between the madman and the mystic? What factors like determine whether someone has like a breakthrough or breakdown?
So we talk a lot about set and setting and the circumstances within which an experience is held. Um, so if you're told that you are mad, that you have a serious mental illness, and you're going to have to take medication for the rest of your life, that is generally very unsupportive to the expression of the part of the psyche which is really looking for healing and trying to be heard. Uh, Whereas, if you are held in a way which is gentle and sympathetic and encouraging and nurturing, then, there's a much greater chance that the part of yourself which is wounded, needs healing, wants to be heard, looking for something greater, is going to find a more fruitful expression. But it's often a complicated journey, especially these really big openings. And you mostly find in the stories of the mystics that they have really had a really tough time, in their developmental crisis when it really could have gone either way. Um, and we know that when people are in a HAP state, a high archetypal penetrance state, they're extremely sensitive to any perception of danger, for example. They can feel very unsafe. So, you can imagine if you live in an unsafe part of town, maybe, your home life is not secure, maybe there are people yelling, maybe there's real danger. You can understand that the sense of unsafety is going to really gather momentum and things really get organized around that. So your psyche contracts, you look for danger in multiple places, and the external world becomes a very hostile place. When I look back to my days in psychiatry, I think one thing that we were often not very good at was helping people to feel safe. And anyone who's in an expanded state, a archetypal penetrance state, the most important thing is to try to make them safe, even when they're feeling really unsafe. We know that in psychedelic work, I mean that's mostly what I do now. I run a training for psychedelic therapists and the Institute of Psychedelic Therapy, and it's a 2-year training, and I think we take people pretty deep. And maybe the most important part of our training is for everybody in the group to feel really, really safe. And we know that you had to feel safe enough to go to those unsafe places in your psyche that are really crying out to be heard. Um, and if you get that wrong, and if people don't feel safe, then that's when you can start getting the complications. Maybe, sometimes the unsafeness becomes projected onto the outside world, and people get paranoid. People are out to get me, and develop stories around that.
Yeah, I like this. It's kind of like this deep existential safety is needed. Um,
Well, it's never possible, it's rarely possible to get that sense of safety, but it's very, very helpful to get as safe as you can to explore the places and ways in which you feel unsafe.
mm,
So that seems to be a really good thing to do, and that seems to release energy from keeping down the defenses against the early wounds, so that you can participate more fully in life and the universal energies, and have a kind of healthy, stable, high archetypal penetrant state where maybe you feel that you flow and you're in touch with the bigger picture, and you can feel authentic, and you feel you're living a life that is meaningful and authentic for you, rather than the more kind of hemmed in life, more constrained life that so many of us can probably relate to, at least at some stage in our lives.
mhm. And you mentioned you're working with psychedelics and this idea of like gateways towards these hap states, whether it's like spiritual practices or maybe just trauma. And I'm curious if you could speak on like the wise and foolish uses of these gateways towards hap states.
Well, I'm not sure about wise and foolish, but in the service of healing, we take set and setting very responsibly. So use has to be intentional. You have to know what you're letting yourself in for. There has to be a degree of informed consent. People need to be able to sit with difficult feelings, because, if you use a psychedelic, you're entering a feeling machine, and the volume and intensity of feelings is going to be really ramped up. And a lot of us are not, accustomed to feeling that much. And then, we're going to get in touch quite likely with some feelings that we haven't really wanted to feel. Maybe some feelings that we felt when we were really younger, when we were really young, and we've repressed ever since. And it's generally a really healthy thing to do, to allow ourselves to feel things. because it takes an awful lot of energy to repress feelings that we don't want to feel. Um, but when stuff comes up, it can be overwhelming. So, again, you need to feel safe. You need to be with good people. You need to be met in a way that you probably weren't met when you first encountered these feelings. So we would always have, at least one, preferably two sitters who you know really well, who you trust, and who can really be with you, be present, with whatever comes up, the difficult things that come up and the beautiful things that come up. Some of these kind of open, connected, joyous states, so they can be witnessed and held. And then, of course, once you come down from these places, the trick is to retain the insights, the energies, the gifts of these states in a way that is useful so that it doesn't just get dissipated. Otherwise, it can just be frittered away and lost like an amazing dream that you just forget.
Yeah, I can see how awareness of hap and these gateways and having kind of a practice that uses safety is quite important.
Yeah.
Um,
It's also important not to overdo it. I mean, I think some people really overuse psychedelics without integrating them properly, and that doesn't seem to work. So just having a few really well-held, powerful experiences, in the right circumstances, right setting, right intention, is often so much better than having multiple unintegrated experiences.
yeah, yeah, and that's what I meant by the foolish approach of just like taking too many
Yeah,
psychedelics.
yeah,
And
yeah.
um, so if you have any questions in the chat, pop them in the chat. We have a few good ones. I have about four more I really want to get to. So what kinds of archetypes are most frequent, are frequently surfaced in a hap state, or is it just like yeah, maybe do you have a taxonomy, or like how do you understand that?
So if you think of pretty much every feeling that you can have, there are bigger forms of that meeting. One of the examples that Plato used was something as beautiful in as much as it participates in the archetype of beauty. Um, there are so many feelings that very commonly come up when you're doing deep work. Some of them are difficult, like, abandonment, disconnection, isolation, alienation, futility, despair. These are the more kind of problematic feelings. And you can imagine what it's like if the intensity of that is really ramped up. So, if you think of despair, that could be ramped up so that the whole universe becomes a despairing place and there is nothing else but despair. Um, some of the more positive archetypes we might connect with are, love, connection, and joy, which is another sort of common, high archetype, high archetype experience. And sometimes that can be ramped up to the extent that we can have one of those experiences of cosmic union. If you're, not many people have these. We know that high dose psychedelics in the right circumstances can give the gift of some of these. Therapeutic work, especially with the terminally ill, may be a bit more likely to have some of these experiences. And then you go to that place where you know that everything is love. Um, and that's something that Plato referred to again with his allegory of the sun in the story of the cave. Um, yeah.
Kind of the type of archetypes and thinking about like historical figures, even modern figures. Jung had a good argument that Nazi Germany, Hitler, was channeling or possessed by Wotan, the archetype of Wotan, um, which like kind of like led to this destructive
Yeah.
force. So in your assessment, do you think someone like Hitler was hap, like had high archetypal penetrance, and perhaps modern powerful figures like Trump, Netanyahu, Putin, are they like because they seem like really plugged in and have a lot of energy and so do you consider these type of people that have hap states, or is this a different phenomenon happening?
I think with the phenomenon of the Nazis in Germany, I think you have to remember the historical context that the German people felt that they'd been given a very bad peace at the end of the First World War and that they'd been kind of ripped off. And then they had this rampant inflation. So the country was in a really bad place. And then I think leaders like Hitler get, they kind of float to the surface on the tide of an archetypal wave. Um, so in a way, he's a bit of a symptom. And then there's something about the archetypal wave that people get very, very excited about. And I don't know if people have seen the film Cabaret, but there's a wonderful scene in that where there's a beautiful young man who's singing a song in a park in Germany, and he's a beautiful blonde young man, looks like the epitome of German youth. And then the camera pans out, and you see the people in the park who are also singing the song, and you can see kind of the rabid energy in their eyes. Uh, but they have been wronged, and along comes something which is going to make it better. So there's kind of a combination of a trauma, uh, a dependency position, looking for someone to make it better. I think we see that a lot in the world at the moment, and then how that captures a more kind of collective unconscious, which is influenced by our ancestral narratives and the folklore, and as you say, the Nazis developed a bit of a thing about the Scandinavian gods as well.
Yeah, that archetypal wave. Yeah, I like that.
I mean, I remember having a conversation with Stan Groff. I think it was in 2016, and the subject of Trump came up, and Groff said, every country has its idiots, but they don't normally elect them to be the president. So I think that captures quite nicely that it's not so much to do with the individual; it's to do with the archetypal currents that are arising in the collective unconscious. The individual is just a peg to hang it on. Um,
Yeah, I think John Michael Greer, he's a druid. He kind of said that Trump has like the Hayoke, like the sacred clown archetype.
yeah, yeah, yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
and so this the other thing I wanted to bring up. So we had this series at the Stoa called the Entity Pill, where we investigated what shamanic and kind of psychedelic circles call disincarnate entities,
Yeah.
like kind of invisible beings that interact with us that seem like they have some kind of ontological status,
Yeah.
independent from us. Like Christian sense as demons, but there's like other dupuk, a jinn. Different traditions have different names for it, and people who you know, have schizophrenia, they hear voices and people talk to them. And I remember Jerry Marzinski, he came to the Stoa and he made the bold claim that these voices are actually entities speaking to people who have kind of like a kind of schizophrenic disposition. And so I'm curious, like, and I know when I had like was in that what I consider a hap state, you just like you just weird shit happens.
Yeah.
Um, and so I'm curious what your thoughts on that and this disincarnate entities, and maybe what's your metaphysics on that too? Are they actually beings, or they're just some part of a wider sense of our psyche?
So that's a really complicated question. So let's start with the question about schizophrenics and there's kind of schizophrenic voices. I don't think they are discarnate entities. I wouldn't rule out the possibility that there might be something like that going on sometimes to some people. But the sort of voices that people hear are very, very derogatory voices. You are this, you are that, really pointing at elements of shame. And it's exactly the sort of feeling states that come up in psychedelic states, when you go to those deeply, deeply wounded places. So, I think that's to do with very, very split off, rejected parts of ourselves that are coming to the surface. And, some of the more avant-garde forms of treatment, like talking therapy, open dialogue, are much better at uncovering those split off parts of ourselves, the parts that we're very ashamed of, for example, and bringing them more into the light. The other part of that question is there such a thing as independent entity forms? Well, why shouldn't there be? And I feel that I don't know much about anything, but I'm pretty sure that consciousness is just related to neurochemical process in our human brains. I think it's much more likely that consciousness is a part of the universe. So inevitably, it's gonna come up in many different ways. in nature, in stuff we see, and in a lot of stuff that we don't see. I think we're normally pretty separate from it. Maybe it influences us in ways that we're unconscious, maybe coming into our dreams and stuff. Maybe there are some people that are very good at tuning into these things. And we know that there are certain substances that probably open the portals so that we have more access to some of these entities.
Yeah,
Yeah.
in my sort of the hap states that felt like I was in, there's like times where like intrusive thoughts emerged. And in the past, I did kind of just more secular kind of there's a book called Imp of the Mind or like Internal Family System, Loving Your Internal Parts that helped. But then it was only like until I engaged in like Christian mysticism and like had a deeper spiritual kind of response that it felt like they went away completely. Um, and so,
Mm.
yeah, it's kind of interesting. Is it just like a psychic thing, or is there elements of it that are,
Yeah.
demonic?
And what was your feeling? I mean, having had some time to reflect on it, do you think that everything came from your own psyche, or does it feel as though some of it came from outside?
Of both, I imagine,
Yeah.
or maybe some
Right.
interplay
Yeah.
between the two.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Um,
I mean,
that's-
that's what Jung felt, isn't it? You know,
yeah.
he was told very sharply by one of his by one of his entities that you may think we're a figment of your imagination, but we're as real as you are.
Hmm. Hmm. So the last question I'll have, and then we'll, if you have any questions,
Yeah.
put them in the chat. It's like it's kind of like how to help people, really, because it could be just like the people I hang out with. Like it feels like more people are popping off, as I like to call it. People seem to reach out to me, like people in my friendship circle, because they know I've had these experiences. But it's largely above my pay grade to actually help them. Even
Yeah.
though I'm a philosophical counselor, I can help people with their worldview and stuff. But I feel uncomfortable, being of service in this way. And and so like how do you like me, for anyone who's experiencing this type of thing, how can we give them resources like your book, obviously, but how can we give them resources like locally to have this kind of existential safety that they can process these things?
So there's a whole literature around what we call spiritual emergency. I'm not sure if that's a very good name for it, but that's the most common name. So I wrote another book with Jules Evans, where there's 14 stories by people who've been through some really really complex states, and and we think about what helps. Um, so there are some things that really help. The most important thing is probably a sense of safety. So make people as safe as you possibly can. Physical safety helps a lot. So some encouragement. So a model that this can be growthful. That this is a movement towards healing, even though it feels really difficult at the moment. Um, some grounding techniques are often really helpful, whatever they are. Might be physical exercise, might be meditation. Sometimes when you're in the middle of something like this, you can't meditate. Your mind is too wild. Sometimes sort of physical exercise, just keeping yourself safe, um, is really good. And then sometimes when things calm down a little bit, some integration, some talking of things through. There are so many forms of integration. Some are more verbal than others. But basically, the model is that this is a way of psychic stuff bringing itself to your attention so that it can be sorted out in a helpful way. Um, but when it comes up, when it escapes the bonds of all the psychological defenses and repression, it can seem very unmanageable. It can seem like you're overwhelmed by this tidal wave. So really the trick is to somehow keep yourself afloat and safe, while it feels as though you're being swept away by the tide, and then to find some tools that you feel you can start working with to put some meaning into that and some structures to keep yourself afloat.
Yeah, that's great. I guess so many more questions, but let's get to some people in the chat. So thanks for sharing that, Tim. Uh, Kevin, I'll take you in if you can mute yourself and ask your questions, Tim.
Hey Tim, yeah, I'm interested in what you called NAP, which is what um, normal archetypal penetrance, and like kind of the whether, yeah, I'm interested in what like that what you consider to be like a normal kind of like I associate that with just like the normal waking consciousness of people, and I'm wondering if like in our collective if most people are indeed, like nap and not in a high archetypal penetrance, like where's the meaning coming from? And I'm wondering, is it possible that like this possible no archetypal penetrance as a normal collective waking state is actually like fueled by a different archetype? For example, like is the psychiatrist world as machine view, which informs the waking state of many, actually an archetype in itself? Like for like are there other times of human period where like our collective consciousness might have been more high, like more might have been more hap? For example, like use the example of Nazi Germany when everyone was mad and they were kind of on this archetypal wave. So I'm wondering like if this kind of like enlightened world as separate from us is kind of an archetype in itself that's related to like the disenchantment of reality. And I want, yeah, that was kind of a mouthful, but I'm wondering what you if you could riff on that.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really great question. I guess the standard answer to that is the idea that in more simple ages, when we were more connected with nature, we were more in tune with the bigger picture, um, and maybe we were more archetypally awake compared to, people these days who, have their stressful commutes into work, live in boxes, worried about mortgage all the time. I'm not sure if that's right. It may be in the halcyon days of the hunter-gatherers. Maybe that was right. The people that did, the Stone Age art in the caves, maybe it was right for them. I think life has always been quite constricted for many people, how to get enough to eat, how to keep yourself safe, etc. So I suppose when I think about normal archetypal penetrance, the story that resonates for me is the Plato's cave story and the normal archetypal penetrance for people who basically conform to consensus reality, and they're looking at the images at the back of the cave, the flickering two-dimensional images, and they think that is it. They think that is reality, and they're not really interested in any other explanation for what's going on around them. And then you get the people, the few, the journeyers, the, the people who either voluntarily or involuntarily turn away from consensus reality and find themselves doing, the quite difficult, hazardous, challenging journey up through the cave, up through the layers of their conditioning, their psychological structures, but with the possibility of reaching the multi-dimensional numinous outside. Um, and I would say they're the hat people, the archetypal penetrance people. There aren't that many of us, and people don't like us very much because they're frightened of us. Um, you know, if you're in the normal archetypal penetrance state, you want to keep it that way. You want to keep on thinking that that's all there is. Um, yeah. Does that answer your question, Kevin?
Yeah, I think my interpretation of how I would answer um, my question based on what you said is that Plato's cave just we keep kind of getting caught in one cave and then maybe have people take people out of the cave and then what the cave is changes, but there's always the cave. I suspect for many people.
Yeah. Yeah. I guess one of the questions is, does it ultimately make any difference
Mm.
if we do that difficult journey up the cave and then we come back to society? Are we gradually becoming, more enlightened, more thoughtful, more consciousness? Are we co-creating something useful? Are we doing something in a participatory universe where, it ultimately makes a difference?
Mhm. No,
Yeah.
thank you.
That's a good question, Kevin. I just put in the chat like a nap compassion, because I felt like when you're dealing with someone who doesn't have that experience of HAP and then you push them
Yeah.
too far, then they can have like ontological shock, as they call it, and then that's like a foolish and unethical way to approach someone.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Jan, I'm going to take you in.
Yes, hello, and thank you so far for the discussion, both Peter and Tim. It's given me a lot to think about, and also I resonate with a lot of what you've been discussing, just from direct experience. It's nice to have a framework to hang my direct experiences off of. So I appreciate the discussion so far. One thing I'm curious about is the rise of ADHD and neurodivergence we're seeing in society today, and whether you've interpreted that as a possible connection to people entering more into a HAP state. So I would imagine if you are neurodivergent, you're drawn towards multiple stimuli, which have maybe inherent meaning for you. So I was wondering whether that's an indication of people entering into HAP states and whether there's any research into that connection.
Yeah, well, I guess I always feel uncomfortable answering questions about ADHD because I don't really, I don't feel I have any good answers for that. I mean, I'm very suspicious of labels. I'm not sure if labels are particularly helpful. I accept that labels like ADHD and other labels are a lot more helpful than some of the labels that have been used in the past. I think we need to meet people where they are, and rather than put people in a box. My experience as someone who no longer practices as a psychiatrist is that the ADHD industry has become a very large one, and there are a lot of people making a lot of money out of it. I'm very happy to believe that there are also a lot of people benefiting from it as well, but I don't have any direct experience of it. Is it indicative of a societal change in one way? In some way, I think that's a really interesting question. Is it a way of society widening their kind of bandwidth to the ways in which people can be different? I think that's a nice way to think about it. When I was practicing as a psychiatrist, I think we were very blinkered. I think we tended to put people in very rigid, narrow little boxes. I think psychiatry has broadened its perspective to some extent, but I'd be really interested to hear a bit about what you think.
Yeah, so I suppose the root of the question, thank you for your response. The root of the question for me is, it's almost like with the various crises we're faced with, you hear about the meta crisis, you hear about global warming, you can move towards more authoritarian control, and all the other kind of crises that we're faced with as a humanity. It's almost my interpretation is that we are being forced to kind of step out of this normal archetypal penetrance, or this kind of maybe like with more numbed, constrained way of seeing the world, and then we are more open to trying to make sense of what's happening around us, because I think for many people the meta crisis is quite nebulous. It's not, you can't really put a finger on it. It's just a word for many people. You don't really understand the implications of it. You hear about ecological collapse and you hear about planetary thresholds being crossed, but this is just words for many people. So they're trying to make sense of all the disruption we're seeing on at a societal and a global scale, and that increases people's thresholds for meaning making.
I think you're also talking about trauma, and most of my work these days is in expanded states work with psychedelics and holotropic breath work over quite long periods of time. And I think what we're finding is that the deeper we go, the deeper layers of trauma we come up against. And the things you described about the modern world we live in, they would resonate. I think with earlier traumas that we've had, other times when we felt unsafe or we felt threatened in various ways. I suspect that the ADHD at its roots is partly a response to some sort of trauma. Are we getting more sensitive? Are we becoming more trauma informed? as society. I think we probably are, and I think that's a good thing. Yeah, thank you.
Right. Thank you.
All right. Joanna, you had a question.
Yeah, hi Tim. Excuse
Hi,
me.
Joanna.
I'm curious if you're aware of like Carl Shedd's work, this Jungian analyst.
Yeah.
Just to add some context. Yeah, so my question is, yeah, Carl Shedd writes about the archetypal protector, and this kind of protector that I'm like talking about is the protector prosecutor archetype.
Yeah.
Which forms after early violence. Sometimes it's interpreted as demonic or divine. And just like personal context, I've met those parts in myself. Um, so yeah, I feel like they're not just defenses, they're sacred, ancestral, and really fierce. And I'm curious, how do we honor the intelligence of those parts without staying trapped in their survival logic? And what does integration of archetypal protectors look like when the wound is collective and ongoing?
So there's a few questions in there, and you're talking about the personal and the collective. I mean, I'm a great admirer of Carl Schett's work, and I think he's defined that particular complex and dynamic really beautifully. And we often find this in really deep work with people that, you know, the places in their psyche that they are most afraid of going to, you know, feel demonic. Sometimes they do get projected onto the outside world in a way that, you know, that can be interpreted as being psychotic. You know, the outside world can become very dangerous and charged and threatening. In well-held states, you know, expanded states and places like that, or in spiritual emergencies, if we can really support people at their most vulnerable moments, you know, when they are in these places where the demon is there. If they can go into the cave where the demons live and tolerate it and be there for a while, then the energies associated with that tend to dissipate, and they even become transmuted. So rather than being something terrifying, it more becomes your ally. So it's like going into a cave with a dragon and making friends with that dragon, and you get some energy from that. On a collective level, I think that's a question that maybe we all need to think about at the moment. You know, I'm an Englishman in the UK. We have not digested or integrated a lot of our history that continues to define our narrative in a way which is unconscious. And we really need to do that. You know, the ways in which we behaved throughout our history, and, you know, the assumptions that we still have in our individual and collective psyches that, you know, no one really talks about. You know, we talked about Nazi Germany earlier. You know, you could say that the Germans did do that. You know, they did confront their demons after World War II, and they became a really decent country. Same with Japan. I guess there's a huge question now, you know, the rise of the alt-right and, you know, Europe, the States, a whole lot of other countries, you know, what you know, how can we start to process the shadow? How can we start to address what cannot be talked about, you know, in a way that brings it into a conversation, in a way that can be creative and can eventually be harnessed so that something actually changes? You know, and some of the terminology that Carl Schad uses, you know, you can see some of these charismatic political leaders using that sort of imagery, you know, the demons, the foreigners, the this, the that. And it really resonates with us because we, you know, there's a part of us that knows exactly what it's talking about. You know, that's why this sort of language is so effective. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Joanna. And Tim, are you okay to like stay 10 minutes after the hour, or do you have a hard stop at
No, I'm good. I'm good.
just because we got some good questions here. Dana, you had a question on NPCs and naps.
Yeah, it was just some thoughts I was having while listening to the conversation and reading that little passage. But like I guess it's mainly just like, reading that little passage, it was talking about like psychiatric disorders and their relation to high archetypal penetrance states. And like, I was just wondering, like, is there ever a way, is there ever like a time period or like situations where HAP gets integrated and becomes sort of like the nap of like the future or whatnot? And I mean, I think Peter also mentioned about how today's lab could become tomorrow's nap or whatnot. But is this all just like subjective states and all that's because the way I am framing it in my mind is that it's just mimetic ideas sort of like just battling it out, and that's just and the end result is the high archetypal penetrance versus the non-archetypal. So I don't know if you could riff on that, but
as you were speaking, what was coming up with me was what does a functional, integrated, higher archetypal life look like? And I suppose it's a life where you feel in touch with, you're functional, but you're in touch with a bigger picture. You're interested in meaning. Life is meaningful. It feels that you're flowing with maybe the energies of that bigger picture, the cosmos, the world around you in a way that works for you. But you feel that you're authentic and, you're living the right sort of life with the right sort of people doing the right sort of things, and you feel open rather than contracted. You feel you feel generally good, but you feel, sometimes you feel sad, sometimes you feel bad, sometimes you feel pretty shit, sometimes you feel few, you feel, but whatever you feel, you honor what you're feeling because it's part of being a feeling human being. um, and I guess in life we go through times when we can do that and times when it's a little harder. Maybe something happens, we have to shut down a bit. Maybe we go from being a bit happy in a good way to happy in a way which is uncomfortable because something happens. We're a bit overwhelmed by meaning. We shut down a bit. Maybe we go a bit lap for a while. I guess for many of us, there are times in life where we work a bit harder than we want to. Had to pay the mortgage or whatever, and things get a bit normal, and maybe we lose touch with the bigger picture and the things that give us joy. And I suppose then the trick is to have people in your life or practices that that help support you back to a more a more integrated state where you feel that you're flowing more and you feel that your life is richer and more authentic.
cool. Yeah, I was writing down some ideas, but yeah, that was some good advice.
Thank you.
All right, Emily, you had a question.
Yes, I do. Hi, Tim. I think we met
Hi,
back
Emily.
at Synthesis
I
a while
remember.
ago.
Yes,
Yeah,
that feels like a different lifetime.
it does. Yeah, so it's great to see you
Yeah.
here. I love dropping in on this discussion. So my question for you, so I've been doing my own work over the last 6 years, and I'm diving into the shadow and some of these
Mm.
archetypes and the terminology. And I've kind of, I think, took a break from society the last couple of years to like do my own internal healing. And now I'm kind
Mm.
of reemerging into workplaces. And now I'm kind of identifying some of these things coming through certain people. And I'm trying to figure out, like I'm not in a healing space at my workplace or out in
Mm.
the everyday. What is the best way to navigate? Usually I would stay away, but if I have to be in a space, where I'm forced to interact with people who I feel like have these certain archetypes come through, maybe predatory, maybe demonic, maybe some of it's defensive, maybe some of it's archetypal stuff coming through. I'm trying to experiment like how do I kind of navigate this where I feel like some people are kind of wanting to pull on my energy or target me a specific way. I don't know if you have any thoughts or insights on that, but that's kind of coming up for me.
Well, thank you so much for bringing that. I mean, it's difficult. This is something that Plato talked about. The challenges of a return. And how to keep yourself safe. When we take people on retreats, we know that people feel vulnerable afterwards, and And it's a real skill in staying open, not shutting down, but staying open in a way that protects yourself, about how to, how not to say too much to people, how to protect your personal space, how to be open to yourself and to people that you trust, but not make yourself vulnerable with people that aren't going to accompany you in a way that is healthy for you. So it's a real dance, and there's a danger of shutting down. If you've been in a very open place, it's beautiful. You want to stay open, but that open place means that we feel very naked and we feel very vulnerable. And sometimes people who don't mean to do us any harm, they say something or they behave in a way that really hurts us. And if that happens, I guess we take it inside and we sort of think about what it is that is hurting us, and how that might resonate with us, and we take care of ourselves. A phrase that we use all the time is curiosity and compassion. So stay really curious, stay really curious about your own processes. And if something sort of hits you and resonates you and triggers with you and causes feelings, then be really, really curious about that. And also, practices that support compassion, compassion to yourself. Because so often when we're wounded, it touches places of, shame and guilt, and we've done something wrong. And, we haven't done anything wrong. We're just human beings trying to get by and trying to heal ourselves. And so any practices that sort of encourage that sense of putting our arms around ourselves, being with other people that can be compassionate to us, but also maybe, sometimes this is harder, being compassionate to people that, that inadvertently hurt us because they don't know what they're doing. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you for that.
And wishing you the best, and really nice to see you again.
Yeah, thank you too.
That's one thing I've always, or I found challenging, is kind of like this notion of compassion for the people who harm you versus like the idiot compassion, like just like allowing the vampire to come in a way that sort of like is harmful,
Yeah.
and having that kind of boundary, spiritual boundary work needed.
Yeah.
So, John, you have a question.
Hi, Tim.
Hi there.
I've been drawn to that piece behind you, and I have a curiosity as to what kind of meaning it evokes and draws out of you. For me, I see it as maybe this might be like a two-parter. For me, I see it as a portal of some sort.
Yeah.
And I'm curious as the second part of how symbols, images, and expressions and pieces of art can communicate or be some sort of portal as well to the experiences of archetypal presences for a person. I'm curious of how that may land or resonate for you.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for that. I mean, we use words, don't we? And words can kind of point at things, but they cannot capture the complexity of the archetypal. The word ineffable, is something that is too complex to describe. So art and symbols are, music, are so useful. I mean, you only have to look at the extraordinary art that Jung produced in his Red Book, to get some idea of what he got from art. I mean, he was such a gifted artist. So the piece of work behind me is from Ecuador. And I have family in Ecuador and spent some time traveling there, and I bought that in a hill village in the Andes, and I guess this was some time ago, and it's always my backdrop. It goes wherever I am, wherever I live, and most of the time I don't really notice it, but it's it's a really important part of my life. And I guess it's a reminder of wherever I am. It's a reminder of the other, the non-verbal, something that points to something else, something that's really complex, maybe, formless. The beauty of that part of the world, the wisdom that they have, um, the genius of the people that created it. It's just such a gift. Yeah. I'm not sure if I've ever spoken about it before, so thank you for asking me that question. It really means a lot to me. If I was to save one possession, that would be it.
Mm.
Yeah. Have you got something? Have you got something like that?
Another question?
No, no. I mean, have you got a piece of art or something that has a similar function for you? I
I
mean,
think I sense that certain items, like
yeah,
just wearing jewelry or of sorts,
yeah,
is like a placeholder of strength, comfort,
yeah,
and solace for me. Like just
yeah,
by placing it on, I feel like its presence is not necessarily a shield, but like a kind of with like a kind of flow within its place, but not too much,
yeah,
not too little, but it's
yeah,
there and holding me in some way,
yeah,
or
yeah,
we're holding each other.
yeah.
I do have another curiosity though,
Go for
if
it.
there's time, Peter. The word subconscious came up when you were responding,
Mm,
and it's like there might be that piece and you might not notice it, but it may have some sort of subtle influences into just the space that you are participating
mm,
in. And I'm curious about what your take is on the subconscious, the subconscious influences of archetypal influences that may, um, is there a kind of power or uh, let's call the words kept coming, the rightness to it not being it within one's conscious aware rather than and it being just somewhere in the periphery or background awareness of
yeah,
of a person's being, and how that may actually how may that may be connected to this archetypal penetrance that
yeah.
you've been speaking about.
I mean, I think we swim in an archetypal ocean and we're affected by archetypal currents of which we are mostly unaware. Um, there's a whole conversation about astrology or archetypal cosmology as developed by Rick Tarnas and Stan Groff, who thought that the transits were um, the only worthwhile determinant of the sort of psychedelic journey people would have. Now, I don't know if that's true or not, but I think it really points to something about the invisible influences. I think that's a really interesting conversation. Um, I mean, we're like little, we're like little sort of specks floating on an ocean. Um, we have a delusion of agency. I think, maybe that's another conversation about determinism. But we don't have as much agency as we think we do. That's for sure.
Cool, thank you.
Thank you, thank you.
That's funny because I was going to just jump in with one final question on agency. I was going to propose something like archetypal agency or agentic archetypal penetrance, like having agency to perhaps weave between, being in a nap state or a hap state. Because I know it's like when I was like full hap, it's like there's like a greediness that I had afterwards to want to return to it. And it's like my hap state just like went to like a lap state, right? Just like crashed. And then
Yeah,
the lap state was actually in retrospect amazing because it gave me the an opportunity to just integrate all these things that weren't being met. Um, and now maybe I'm kind of like weaving between like nap and hap, and I feel like there's optionality for me to like gateway to a hap. But then there's sort of like, it feels like wise cautiousness about doing
yeah.
that. And so, yeah, I'm just curious if you have any thoughts about like the agency piece and being agentic, weaving between these states.
Yeah, I mean, Well, you say you went into a lap state and it was useful for integrating. I would suggest that it's like the high tide of a hap state recedes, and you then have the ability to to start processing from a different perspective what you've been through. So maybe it's still even a bit of a hap state, but a different sort of a hap state, because you wouldn't say it's a normal state, because you're sense making, you're meaning making. Um, a lapse state, I guess, would be really quite a depressed shutdown state where, it was all a bit too much. If a defenses crash in and you're quite impervious. I mean, in terms of agency, I think we do have agency in terms of hap hunting. We take ourselves to, the festivals, the nature places. We go to our retreats, we have our intentional psychedelic experiences, etc. And I think it's really good to do these things, carefully and mindfully. Obviously some spontaneity when that feels right, but to do it carefully and mindfully, so that when you're hap hunting, you have some good safe structures around you, good people around you. You have some practices that you can draw on. You can take care of yourself. It's like sort of sowing a crop, and you want to reap a good harvest from it that's nourishing.
Do you think, because I think when the state I'm referencing toward, it was like a good duration, a good time period. I felt like everything was just super meaningful. And I'm like, wow, it was like such a reference point. Can like life be like this all the time? Um, and yeah, what do you think about that, about like sustaining it in a regenerative way, this hap state, instead of just sort of like having these sort of like hap hunting for, peak experiences?
Yeah. Well, I think some people can do that. I think some people who meditate a lot can do it. Not many. I think we can all turn up our meaning a bit. You know, feel nature a bit more, feel the love and connection a bit more. I think the things to work on are openness, connection, and joy, and the ways in which we defend ourselves against trauma. And I think for most of us, that's a lifelong journey. Do we ever get there? So the job is done. Well, maybe we mostly don't. I mean, I certainly haven't at my age. I'm still working on stuff and trying to stay open, and it's like an onion skin. Stuff comes up that I haven't come across before that needs a bit of work. Circumstances change. Yeah. So I think enjoy the journey, and hopefully as we develop more resources, the journey is less frightening and more rewarding.
Yeah, amen. Um, cool. So I think this is a good place to gently close.
Yeah.
Tim, any kind of thoughts or anything you're leaving with or you took away from the session that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think you're doing a great job. I mean, I think the way, we've only just met, but the way in which you're using your own experience to try to give back something to the community, and and host something, and create some energy. I think that's great. I really enjoyed the conversation that we've had. I mean, there's some great people in this room, so it's one of these hopeful, expansive conversations. So thank you so much for inviting me. I've enjoyed it.
Yeah, beautiful. I appreciate that share, and then and also appreciate your frameworks, your models. It was quite helpful for me to kind of understand my experiences. I feel like it's a very high leverage framework for people who are going through these things to kind of like ground them. So again, Tim's book is Waking Shadows, Archetype and Psyche in Crisis and Growth. So feel free to check that out. And yeah, we're taking a pause for the rest of summer. Probably be back in the fall. So I hope everyone has a blessed summer. And Tim, everyone, thanks so much for coming to the Stoa today.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye, everyone.